Hello, my name is Elijah Huntington, and today this presentation will examine how the respiratory and renal systems work together to maintain acid-base balance. This is a critical component of homeostasis. I'll highlight the mechanisms each system uses and how they coordinate to keep blood pH within a narrow and life-sustaining range. Let's start with why the coordination of these systems matters. Blood pH must remain between 7.35 and 7.45, 7.4 being the magic number. I want you to take note of the pH scale on the screen and the colors. I've color-coded certain sections of this presentation to help identify what processes might be acidic, basic, or neutral. Blue represents basic, and orange represents acidity, like an orange. Even small deviations in pH can disrupt enzyme activity, alter ion channels, and impair neural function or cardiovascular function. This makes acid-base regulation one of the most tightly controlled physiological processes. As we will discuss later, many conditions can arise to make these mechanisms go awry. The body constantly produces acids. CO2 from aerobic metabolism forms carbonic acid, protein metabolism generates fixed acids, and during exercise, lactic acid from the fermentation cycle of anaerobic metabolism also adds to the acid load. These inputs require continuous buffering and removal. To save us from our acidic blood and metabolic cycles, the body has a buffer system. Similar to how a web page might buffer and stop you during your work, pH buffers stop pH from sliding too harshly in either direction. The bicarbonate buffer system is the most important in the blood. Bicarbonate is generated when CO2 combines with water to form carbonic acid. This then dissociates into carbonate and hydrogen ions. This reaction occurs rapidly in red blood cells and is reversible, allowing bicarbonate to neutralize excess acid. Protein buffers, such as and especially hemoglobin, bind hydrogen ions through their amino acid side chains. Because proteins are so abundant inside cells and in plasma, they provide a large reservoir for buffering sudden pH changes. Finally, phosphate buffers operate mainly inside of cells and in the kidneys. The dihydrogen phosphate pair helps stabilize intracellular pH and plays a key role in renal excretion of hydrogen ions. Together, these systems provide immediate resistance to pH changes. The respiratory system adjusts ventilation to regulate CO2, which directly influences pH. Increasing ventilation removes CO2 and lowers pH, while reduced ventilation allows CO2 to accumulate and raises pH. This mechanism is especially important in medical settings. For example, patients with diabetic ketoacidosis, also known as DKA, will hyperventilate to blow off CO2 to compensate for metabolic acidosis. This is known as Kussmaul's respirations. Another example is COPD, where chronic hypoventilation leads to CO2 retention and respiratory acidosis. In intubated patients, respiratory rate and tidal volume are artificially controlled, so clinicians must adjust ventilator settings carefully to maintain appropriate CO2 levels and prevent dangerous pH shifts. The kidneys provide long-term control by excreting hydrogen ions and reabsorbing or generating bicarbonate. Although slower than respiratory compensation, renal regulation is essential for restoring pH after chronic disturbances. Because this response unfolds over hours to days, the renal system is especially important in long-term acid-base disorders. Patients in renal failure lose the ability to excrete hydrogen ions and regenerate bicarbonate, leading to progressive metabolic acidosis. Acute renal failure can develop rapidly from causes such as severe dehydration, heat stroke, or rhabdomyolysis. Without functioning renal compensation, pH can deteriorate quickly into metabolic acidosis. These systems work closely together. The respiratory system responds rapidly to acute pH shifts, while the kidneys provide sustained correction. For example, during exercise, CO2 and lactic acid rise. The respiratory system increases ventilation to remove CO2, while the kidneys adjust acid excretion if the activity is prolonged or repeated. Another example of respiratory and renal cooperation is respiratory failure. In respiratory failure, hypoventilation or extremely shallow and inefficient breaths cause CO2 to accumulate, leading to respiratory acidosis because blood pH decreases. The kidneys compensate by retaining bicarbonate, providing long-term basic buffer to support this impaired respiratory function. In summary, acid-base balance is a prime example of multi-system homeostasis. The respiratory and renal systems work together to stabilize pH, ensuring proper cellular function and overall physiologic stability. The respiratory system handles rapid CO2 adjustments, while the renal system manages hydrogen ion excretion and bicarbonate regeneration. It's important to remember that protein and phosphate buffers also play essential roles. As protein buffers, especially hemoglobin, bind to the excess hydrogen ions in the blood, and phosphate buffers help stabilize intracellular pH and support renal acid excretion. Together, these systems form a coordinated network that protects the body from dangerous pH shifts. Okay, and here are my references. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.